participants on the call, including you. You are joining your conference as a participant. For a menu of available commands, press *#.
Cabrera, and I am an Emergency Management Program Specialist and FEMA Individual and Community Preparedness Officer in the Region 2 Caribbean Office in Puerto Rico. With me are also my colleagues Deborah Costa from our office in New York and Sammy Arriaga from our office in Puerto Rico. I'm going to provide a few technical considerations before we begin. Today's webinar is being recorded and captured. The archive event will be available on the FEMA website in the coming weeks. You should hear audio through your computer speakers, so please ensure the volume is turned up so you may hear the proceedings accordingly. In the right top corner, we ask if you would like to receive news updates from Region 2. If so, please enter your email address and we will be sure to add you to the distribution list. We will have a question and answer session after the presentation concludes. You will see a Q&A pod in the lower right-hand corner. Please feel free to submit your questions about the subject matter here. And time permitting, we will do our best to answer them. The PowerPoint presentation, along with other educational material from today's presentation, will be available for you to download in the file share pod as PDF format. You can click on the file and download it using the download button. Finally, at the end of the seminar, there will be a poll with 3 simple questions that we recommend you answer to help us improve this type of training. With that said, I would like to turn over to our colleague, Deborah Costa.
Thanks, Lourdes. Did you know that FEMA's #1 goal in our strategic plan is to build a culture of preparedness? The Region 2 Individual and Community Preparedness Program is focused on preparing individuals and communities for disasters by providing useful information and training, inspiring people to act and be ready for any emergency. Good afternoon. I'm Debbie Costa, the Community Preparedness Officer for FEMA Region 2. On behalf of our team working to strengthen preparedness across New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, I'd like to welcome you to our Preparedness webinar series. As part of that goal, we're pleased to be hosting today's webinar in partnership with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, for a webinar about healthy homes. HUD's Office of Lead Hazard Control and Healthy Homes has developed multiple new publications on implementing healthy homes concepts and practices customized for the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. This webinar will provide an overview of all the publications, including why these guides were developed and how they can be used. Our speaker today, Mr. Michael Goldschmidt, is an architect, associate teaching professor in the Department of Architectural Studies at the University of Missouri, and a state housing and environmental design specialist with University of Missouri Extension. Since 2014, Mr. Goldschmidt has led the USDA HUD National Healthy Homes Partnership as the director. Michael has over 30 years of experience in disaster recovery, repair, and restoration of homes and buildings, with a particular expertise in tornadoes and severe storms. Michael, I'd like to hand the mic over to you.
Thank you very much, Lourdes. I'm very happy to be here. I'm looking forward to talking to everyone about this subject. We're going to be talking about 2 specific subjects that actually do combine in some of the guides I'm going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about disaster recovery using Healthy Homes principles, and also we're going to be talking about just general Healthy Homes principles. So the main reason for this webinar is that through my partnership with Housing and Urban Development, Office of Lead Hazard Control, and Healthy Homes, we've developed some specific guides for the Caribbean region, especially for Puerto Rico, in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And I want to talk about that today. But I first want to talk about some of the expertise that I have. During the introduction, it talked about my specialties. I also have partners through the National Healthy Homes Partnership that I run, and some of those partners are in hurricane regions, some of them are in earthquake regions, and so as the partnership gets together, we talk about these guides and how to go about creating guides that are specific for a certain population, either by location or by status or other criteria that we would use. So this slide actually shows a picture of me in Joplin, Missouri after the F5 tornado. And so I do have a lot of experience. Basically what happens is that when there is a major event, especially in the state of Missouri, I am something like this. This is the tornado in Joplin. The first responders come out and they will obviously do whatever emergency services they need to. And then what they do is they bring in some specialized building inspectors that have specific training in what happens to buildings during disasters, again, tornadoes, earthquakes, hurricanes. And so I have decades of experience in looking at what happens to houses and what happens to buildings after these disasters. And then more importantly, what should people do after those disasters to not only to clean up and to keep safe, but really how to look at how to repair and restore those houses and buildings so that they are more resilient to these disasters in the future. So a little bit about where I've been. I've been all over the country, although I specifically do a lot of work in Missouri. I have been to the Caribbean as part of this project to look at some of the hurricane damage in Puerto Rico and especially St. Thomas and St. Croix. And so most of what we're going to talk about today are these guides that were developed specifically for you in Region 2, especially if you are in, again, the Caribbean islands. So a little bit about the Healthy Homes Partnership, because it's important to understand how we're involved in all of these guides. We are funded by the HUD Office of Lead Hazard Control and Healthy Homes through an interagency agreement with USDA, National Institute of Food and Agriculture. What we are as a partnership are what we call extension and outreach educators. For those of you that may be on St. Thomas, you might know that at the University of Virgin Islands, there actually is a housing specialist named Dale Morton who was actually involved in this project in a lot of capacity. I also worked a lot with Magali Mendez in Puerto Rico, who is in the HUD office there. So we have these partnerships where we get people together that are knowledgeable on that subject. The Healthy Homes Partnership has been around for 20 years. It started out in the University of Wisconsin, then it was at Auburn, but for the last 7 to 8 years, it's actually been here at the University of Missouri. So we're sort of centralized in all the states and territories so we can respond to these events. So that's a little bit about the Healthy Homes Partnership. What I want to talk about first is where we started with this project. So what we ended up with is 8 guides, and if you, this was talked about in the introduction, but if you look at the download screen, you'll see that there's 9 downloads. 8 of those are the guides I'm going to be talking about today, and you can actually go to download and download all of them at once. It may slow down your computer, so you may want to wait till the question and answers, but if you want to know where are these 8 guides I'm talking about because you really want them, which I hope you do, you can download them. So I will be referring to those guides during the presentation, but I want to talk about where we started. Because we didn't start from scratch. We had a lot of people with expertise in hurricanes and tornadoes and other disasters that would affect people in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. But there are 2 guides that predate what we did with disaster recovery using Healthy Homes principles. The first is the guide on the left, which is called Rebuild Healthy Homes. It was created by a colleague of mine at Louisiana State University. I contributed a substantial amount of the content and editorial work of that guide, but it is I would call it a generic guide for all disasters in all locations. So it's not necessarily specific to Puerto Rico or the U.S. Virgin Islands, but it talks about the same disasters that would affect those areas. But it also talks about things like wildfires, and it talks about earthquakes, and it talks about tsunamis, and it talks about a lot of different disasters, some of which may be common in some locations and some are uncommon. So this guide is 80 pages, and that's one of the reasons why we developed our guides, because as a disaster recovery and healthy homes agency that you represent, it would be next to impossible if you have thousands of people who have just survived a disaster to hand out 80 pages guides to everybody. But it is the reference guide that we use for the guides I'm going to be talking about in a minute. So one of the things I recommend is in the downloadable guides that we're bringing here today, there are links to both of these booklets. Actually, they're almost as big as books. And your agency should have at least one copy of each of these. So the links on these, again, are in the guides you can download. And the Rebuild Healthy Homes is sort of the generic guide for restoring and disaster recovery and rebuilding according to healthy homes principles. So make sure that everybody's healthy, that the final work is actually also healthier to the occupants. And also, it's basically the guide that everybody's using across the United States and in the territories. The second guide, which is on the right, is called Keep Safe, a guide for resilient housing design in island communities. This was actually developed through a number of partners in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands with some help from, I believe, from FEMA Area 2. This guide is great. It goes into tremendous detail about disaster recovery and resiliency to disasters, but it's 234 pages, actually 243 pages. So again, it's a great guide that you should have one copy of, and it is just too big to hand out to thousands of people in your region when there is a disaster. So on the Keep Safe, one of the things it's really good at is, unlike the Rebuild Healthy Homes, which is sort of generic for all areas, the Keep Safe is actually specifically geared towards Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And it goes through extensive details, like even things like how many nails should you have when you're restoring wood, what kind of concrete you should use if you're rebuilding, what to expect in damage. So again, both of these guides you should have at least one copy of in your agency, because these other guides we're going to talk about, which are much shorter and much more of summary of the information, do reference these guides quite a bit. So the second thing is we're going to be talking about some new healthy homes guides. So these are not specifically towards disaster recovery, but these are guides on how to make sure that your place does not have mold, your house does not have mold, that your house does not have radon. And so it's going to be useful to the clients you work with through your agency. And we're going to be talking a little bit about what's included in these guides. But we started with these. So these were the generic guides that we worked with HUD and USDA to look at safe and healthy homes throughout the United States and all the territories. So the first guide on the left is actually what we call the consumer guide. It's only 8 pages, and it gives some very important information like what is mold, what is radon, what is carbon monoxide, and how to check your home for those items, and then how to make sure that you have all of the healthy homes principles, which we'll talk about in a second. The second guide, which is on the right, is actually has the same name, but this is what we call the stakeholder guide. This is approximately 40 pages, and again, we recommend that you have a copy of each of these because it's helpful to see where this information came from in the guide specific for Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So the stakeholder guide would be the guide that you would use as an agency to look at specific problems that a client is having in their house, that you can advise them on how to make these changes either to behavior or to the specific structure of the building, so that you eliminate things like mold or radon or home safety hazards for older adults and for young children. So this is where we started. So we had 2 guides on healthy homes, one for consumers and one for stakeholders. And then we also had these 2 guides out there, the Keep Safe, which was developed by the Enterprise Corporation, and Rebuild Healthy Homes, which was part of the partnership through Louisiana State University. So now I want to talk about are guides, which are specific to your region and are a little bit easier to comprehend, a little bit easier to distribute in mass quantities. And these are the guides that are in the download window on this webinar. First of all, we started with the guides we talked about before, and then we had focus group meetings. The picture on the bottom left is actually in Puerto Rico in the HUD office. The picture on the right is in the extension office in the University of U.S. Virgin Islands, and Dale Morton, our housing specialist and our partner there, is in that picture. So we met twice with everybody, and I literally did go into all of these places. So I visited Puerto Rico and all three of the U.S. Virgin Islands. Took a lot of pictures of the most recent hurricane damage that everybody had. We talked about what issues were important, and one of the main things that we did is we talked about how do we get this information into much smaller guides so that we can get them to people in large quantities, either through email or printing out these guides, so that people are not overwhelmed by a 243-page guide or a 80-page guide, which would be difficult, again, for people. And what I've learned from disaster recovery, especially right after the disasters, people are already overwhelmed, and sometimes they're almost in a trance of not even sure what their next step is. And so you don't want to just hand them this gigantic guide and expect them to absorb all of the information. So the other thing that these focus groups did is almost everybody in each of these pictures is actually an expert in their field, either in healthy homes or disaster recovery. And so these people peer-reviewed these guides over and over again. I think we went through about 25 different iterations of these guides just to make sure we could get it perfectly right. And then again, the main goal here is not to have these generic guides for your region, but have specific focused guides for Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So the next part of this presentation through at the end is going to be talking about these guides. These are the same guides in the download screen. And I want to first talk about the disaster recovery and rebuilding publications. There's 3 guides there. The first is what we call the full guide, which is 36 pages. It's still pretty big. We'll talk about how we developed that and the other guides related to this. So for Puerto Rico, there is a 36-page guide that goes through extensive discussion of the disasters that would be common, steps on how to secure the site after disaster, how to make sure everybody has the correct protective equipment, and talking about how to rebuild. And a lot of times in the full guide, it will refer to the other 2 guides, the Keep Safe and the Rebuild Healthy Homes, for more specific information. So you're not overwhelming them with how many nails go into this board, or what kind of concrete should I use, or what kind of roofing system I should use. It mostly talks about what categories of things that people should be looking at. So obviously a 36-page guide is also somewhat difficult if you want to distribute into the thousands of copies to everybody in a particular region that have been affected by a disaster. So we have 2 summary guides. The first is a 2-page guide, which pretty much has a very quick summary of the titles that you would find in the full guide. So we talk about, how to secure the site in a few sentences, how to look at rebuilding safely, and how to rebuild more resilient. But most of it on the back side, so the front side you're actually seeing a picture of, the back side actually has what we call the hot links and the phone numbers of specific places in Puerto Rico that a person would need to call right away after a disaster. So 3 guides for Puerto Rico, 36-page full guide, an 8-page summary guide, and then a 2-page guide. So the 2-page guide was meant for, people will lose internet a lot of times in a disaster. So it's not like they can go onto a website and download these guides. So we were thinking about that this is the kind of guide that you would print in mass quantities through your agency, and then be able to hand out to people right after a disaster, so that at least they could get an idea of the specific things they need to think about right away. One of them, of course, is to contact FEMA. And so these are for Puerto Rico. And then there is a companion set of guides, again, a 36-page guide, full guide, and a summary 2 and 8-page guide, which talk about the specific topics that we talked about with Puerto Rico, but specifically for the U.S. Virgin Islands. So one of the things I want to point out that's very important is on the summary guides, the 2- and 8-page guides and the full guides, that when you get to the links in the back, there are some links to FEMA and to go to ready.gov and to what we call the national governmental or consumer agencies that a person would normally contact. But they also have specific phone numbers and specific links to, in the Puerto Rican guide, to Puerto Rico agencies that you would need to call, like, for instance, the Red Cross office in Puerto Rico. And then the U.S. Virgin Island guides have specific phone numbers and links to information specifically for the territories of the U.S. Virgin Islands. So that's the summary of the disaster guide. So we're going to get deeper into these guides now and talk about what's in them. The first thing that's in the guides, whether it's the 2-page summary or the longer 36-page guide, is a summary of natural disasters that are common to Puerto Rico and to the U.S. Virgin Islands. And there are some similarities between the two areas, but there's also some differences. So we have specifically tailored these guides. So I guess what I'm trying to say, to make a long story short, is you would not want to use the Puerto Rico guide for the U.S. Virgin Islands or vice versa. The second thing that the guides have is how to create a plan for safe cleanup, repair, and restoration of homes. So the summary guide might say, secure this site, check for hazards. The 8-page guide is going to talk about that there's 2 or 3 sentences per each of those topics. And then the full guide goes on for almost a page for each of these topics. So it depends on how deep you want to get into the topic. So we have various levels of pages on each of these guides. And then, as I mentioned before, at the end of each of these guides is what we call consumer resources. And so, again, you can see from this slide, which is Puerto Rico, it has things like the Power Authority and the asthma agencies in Puerto Rico that you would want to call. For instance, in a disaster and you have, asbestos, or you have insulation that's coming down, somewhere, or something toxic, it's a way of calling somebody to say, I have asthma, I'm concerned about this stuff that just happened from this hurricane. It gives you an easy way to call. And in each of these cases, if they have TTY for people who are deaf or blind, there's a number for that also. So we're trying to be comprehensive with how people can quickly get a hold of these consumer agencies specific for those areas. So the other thing that's in the guides that's very, very important, and I've had a lot of experience even in tornadoes where you go out to a disaster area and even with the best intentions, people are trying to do things, and I definitely sympathize with them. My heart breaks every time I meet someone who's trying to go back into their home when it's unsafe and it could collapse, or there could be major toxins or a gas leak, but they're very concerned about everything that's in them, and I understand that. But this is sort of where we get to the point where we say, if you're going to do that, either you're working with an agency or you're going into your own home after disaster, here's the absolute essentials that you need to have. And so the first one is there are guides in each of these 3 guides for each of the areas on how to protect yourself. It talks about PPE, personal protective equipment. It also is very sympathetic to the reality of the situation. So yes, we do talk about having a P100 respirator, and but we know that not everybody's going to have one of those. So it also talks about, this is the best respirator, but if you have not a dust mask, but an N95, and hopefully everybody now knows what an N95 is because there's been a lot of talk about it with COVID. And also just how to protect yourself at any level, regardless of your your income or how much preparation you had in obtaining these things. For instance, in Joplin, right after the tornado, it actually hit the Home Depot and the Lowe's, and so all the hardware stores had been demolished. So there was none of this protective equipment. So this is also a guide. So as your agency is doing some teaching about disaster that may happen, how to be prepared for that, then this guide is going to talk about where to get that information on that. We talk about assessing the damages and hazards, how to determine if there's a gas leak, how to determine if there's a water shooting up out of a pipe, what do you do to turn the water off. We talk about creating a work plan, which is you don't just go in there and just start, gathering things up and taking them out of the house. You really have to have a plan of things that are going to be thrown away. Where do they go? Do they go curbside? Do I have to separate the recyclables? What do I have to do then to restore and to basically recover from that disaster through rebuilding? We talk about, cleaning the materials and decontaminate. Some materials must be thrown away, especially if they have mold on them or severe water damage. Some can be repaired and decontaminated without removing them. And then in each of the guides, we talk a little bit about what should go back in the place of what was destroyed or severely damaged that would make it less likely to be damaged then when the next disaster hits. So the rebuild publications, the disaster recovery rebuilding publications, Safe and Healthy Disaster Recovery has these main disasters. So there are some disasters that might go beyond that, for instance, hail damage, but we wanted to cover, especially in the smaller summary guides, the really most common ones that a person might face through various disasters. The other thing is on the personal protective equipment, as I mentioned before, we are very specific in each of the guides about what it is you need to have either before or right after the disaster, what you need to do to safely go into your home, or if you're an agency like many of you are today on this webinar, what personal protective equipment you should have when you're going into a client's home or to be assisting with disaster recovery. So these are talking about eyes and what should be on your head and what should be in the respirators and what should be on your hands. We also talk about, again, that some people don't have a respirator and some people don't have the disposable clothes they can wear. So we talk about how to use your own clothes, but you got to wash it. You got to make sure you don't wear the same clothes every day, things like that. Okay. So back to the guide. So that's inherent in all the guides. When you look at the 36-page guides, one of the things that you should know is that not only does it give a lot of information about the specific disaster. So for instance, on the picture on the left, which is from the 36-page guide, it talks about a lot, not only floods and hurricanes and tropical storms, but what kind of damage would be expected from those disasters. Another page in the guides is this checklist that we give so that a person can say, okay, if I'm going to prepare in advance for a disaster, especially hurricane or other kind of disaster that would be in Puerto Rico or U.S. Virgin Islands, what kind of stuff can I prepare? Do I need a flashlight? Do I need to go ahead and have some type of respirator? So we've provided in the 36-page guide a really good checklist of everything that a person should have, and it is based on the FEMA and ready.gov information, specifically geared towards Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. The summary guides have a summary of this. It will say, make sure you have the proper preparation materials and the PPE, and then it will refer to the larger guide. Again, in each of the guides, we have, in the large guides, the 36-page guides, we have a chapter on special concerns. For instance, this is one of the things that came out of the focus groups and the discussions, that in some areas, mosquito-borne illnesses would be a problem right after a disaster. So we addressed that. In the U.S. Virgin Islands, there's a concern, and it's true in Puerto Rico, but very much so in U.S. Virgin Islands, that people have cistern problems after disaster so that their drinking water is contaminated. So we address these specific concerns in the guides. Again, we have active web links. If the internet's out, obviously you're going to hand people a copy of this. But if they do have the PDF, the links are hot links, so you can just click on it. It's going to go directly to that source. In the case of the phone numbers, if you have a smartphone, it's going to automatically dial that number. The other thing we have, and you can see this on the left side of this page, is some guides to specific HUD guides. There's a HUD guide for mold, radon, carbon monoxide, lead paint, for workers. So let's say your agency is the worker going to that damaged home. it talks about protection and concerns that you should have as a worker, but then it also has the same guides for consumers. So these are, 8 to 10 guides that HUD has, and these are linked from these publications. In the larger guides, 36-page guides, we also have some preliminary information about if you are rebuilding these homes, either you're an agency helping them with the rebuilding, or you're a consumer that just has to do it themselves because they have the knowledge or expertise and they can't wait for an agency to come in and rebuild. We talk about how to put back things so they are more resilient. So the next time a hurricane comes, that there won't be that kind of damage, extensive damage that you had the first time because you have rebuilt better than you had before. And a lot of this information does, in the Rebuilding for Resiliency, does go back to the Keep Safe Guide and the Rebuild Healthy Homes Guide, which has literally step-by-step instructions on what to put back, how to put back a better window, how to put back a better roofing system for Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. One of the parts of the large guides, 36-page guides, that we really had to put in because it was one of those requests that we got from people in the focus groups and consumers and agencies was, a lot of the guides don't have a lot of information about financial concerns and financial recovery after disaster. So we have some pages in the guides on, how do you go about contacting an insurance agent? We realize some people on the Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands don't have insurance. Their house has been handed down from generations, but there's still, reasons to call FEMA. There's still other agencies that will come down, and how to get a hold of them and how to prepare your financial information, how to protect that financial information before the disaster so it's readily available if you have to use it then post-disaster. So these guides do cover that. Again, I referenced the HUD guides earlier. This is an example of the page from the HUD guide. You notice it's HUD, FEMA, EPA, CDC, and NIH that put together these guides. Again, there's a set of guides for consumers on how to remove the mold after a disaster. There's guides on the workers, and you can find these at hud.gov/healthy homes. And they're also, again, hot linked in these guides. So that's a summary of the disaster recovery guides. In addition to that, we have created 2 separate guides that don't talk about disaster recovery and rebuilding and personal protection equipment, but address general concerns on healthy homes. So either it's a home that has already been restored, or it's a home that did not have a disaster on it. And so these guides are based on one of the first slides I talked about. There was a consumer guide on healthy homes and a stakeholder guide. These are the specific guides where we've taken that information, added information specifically to Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. We've also removed things from the generic guides that would not apply to these. For example, a lot of people in some areas of this region may not have exhaust fans in their bathrooms, so they're using natural ventilation for high humidity in certain rooms. So we've tailored these to specific. We haven't taken out information that would apply to other people on Puerto Rico or U.S. Virgin Islands, but we're addressing, again, through peer review, the main concerns that a person would have in their homes. And again, the Puerto Rico one should not be used for the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the U.S. Virgin Islands should not be used for Puerto Rico, although there is, again, overlap. There are some specific items that relate to those islands. And again, that's one of the reasons why we had the focus groups. We had, some people in Puerto Rico from the university, Magali from the HUD office, and various people from asthma agencies. And then the U.S. Virgin Islands, we had similar people, but again, from those islands. So these guides are approximately 20 pages each. If you subtract the front page and the blank sheets that you have to make it a full booklet, they're less than that. So again, they're easily guides that you could print up in advance and give them to people. So if you have a person coming saying, I have asthma, but I'm not sure why I have asthma, and it may be from a defect in the building or some other behavioral thing, these guides will address that specifically for this area. So for those of you that may not be familiar with it, both the disaster recovery guides and the healthy homes guides are based on the 8 principles of a healthy home. So we're talking about you're going back into a home after a disaster, what principles should you have in your mind, but also just generically in a home, what should you be looking for? So the 8 principles, some of you, if you've been around a while in healthy homes or disaster recovery agencies, you may think, well, there's 7, but there actually was an 8th one added about 7 to 8 years ago to address temperature control, because people will have issues if it's too hot or too cold. The 8 principles are: keep it dry, keep it contaminant-free, keep it pest-free, keep it safe, keep it clean, keep it well-maintained, keep it well-ventilated, and keep it temperature controlled. So everything in the Healthy Homes Guides is going to address these 8 principles as it looks at various issues in the home. And these are also inherent in the disaster recovery guides when we're talking about if we're going to rebuild back better than before, more resilient. What are the items in this 8 principles of healthy homes do we need to incorporate into that design? This is a page out of those guides. You can see in the Healthy Homes Guide, there's a picture of, that's actually Dale Morton's hand from the University of Virgin Islands, installing a smoke detector. You can see the picture of lead paint peeling off of the building. So the guide starts off with introducing you to the 8 principles of a healthy home, and then it has 10 questions that you either ask your client or your client can ask themselves. For example, the first one on this page is, was the structure built before 1978? And many of us know that if any structure was built before 1978, there is a high probability that the paint, especially the exterior paint and on the trim, might have lead in it, which is obviously a hazard especially to children under 6 years old. So in each of these 10 questions, there's 11 actually in Puerto Rico because radon is more of an issue. But it addresses what you're looking for, when you answer the question, how to mitigate the problem or remove the problem as much as possible. And if you can't do that, who should you call? Who should you contact for follow-up information to give you advice on how to make your home healthier when it comes to mold or radon or carbon monoxide? So it goes through each of these toxins and it talks about it in the form of questions that would be answered. And then I talked about that there's 11 for Puerto Rico and 10 for U.S. Virgin Islands, but this is a good idea of the questions that those specific questions are asking. Was the apartment built before 1978? Do people smoke in your home? Especially if you have asthma, that's going to be an issue. Where are the sprays and cleaners and poisons in the home so that children can't get to it? What is integrated pest management, so you don't have to use a lot of toxic chemicals for rodent or bug control? What to do if you think you have radon in the home, and how to protect your home in case there's a fire. What kind of smoke detector do you need, and things like that. Okay, so the other thing that is in the Healthy Homes publications is this room-by-room checklist, and this is something that we've developed over a number of years with a lot of different partners: HUD, USDA, FEMA, NIH, CDC, which is basically, we know that especially in the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, it is not possible for every agency to go out and see every person. We just don't have the staff, we just don't have the capacity to do that. So the first thing that's suggested is that they bring in a professional. Usually it's your agency or an agency that you are aware of that would come in and inspect the home for these problems. But we also know that that's not common to some places, so we've given this checklist as a form of something that an actual homeowner or renter could go in through their own home and check to see what is the likelihood that they have lead paint, and how to keep children away from that if they can't get rid of it or mitigate it right away. What kinds of things would you notice in a bedroom? What kind of things would you notice in a kitchen that would be unsafe or be issues that you would be concerned about with healthy homes? A couple other things about the guides that we really like a lot, and again, it was suggested in the beginning of this project, which is what we call a maintenance schedule. And this is something that we found has been very helpful with homeowners and renters, which is, everybody knows they need to mop the floor occasionally, and they need to vacuum, and they need to check wiring and things like that. But the question came up, how often do they need to do that? So we came up with this really great maintenance chart. And again, it's specific to Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And it talks about what a homeowner should do every day. What should he do once a week, once a month, every 6 months, and then every year. And we find that this has been very popular in these guides so that people can say, okay, I know I need to mop the floor more often than I used to, or I don't need to inspect the smoke detector as often as I need to. So it's been very helpful to clients. Again, in the Healthy Homes publications, just like with the disaster recovery publications, we have some specific items that are important for the specific region it's addressing. So in the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, these special concerns vary. But for instance, in the U.S. Virgin Islands, as I mentioned with disaster recovery, there is this issue with cisterns and how does a person clean out their cistern for their drinking water and how to avoid adding chemicals to it accidentally, say, for instance, redoing a roof and then finding out the chemicals for the glue for the roof ended up in the drinking water. So that's where we do these special concerns. Again, just like with the disaster recovery guides, there's active web links and telephone hotlines, many with TTY. So a person, if they have the PDF of it, can click on a link that's going to go directly to that information for follow-up information. Again, on the telephone hotlines, if they click on it, it's going to automatically dial it on a smartphone. And then we also have two other things that we have put into these guides. One is we have smartphone apps that are available. And instead of going over those, because I want to save time for questions, one of the things that we've put into this links to the smartphones, we do actually have Healthy Homes and disaster recovery apps. There's actually an app for Rebuild Healthy Homes. And so you can actually add those to your smartphone. And they have room-by-room checklists for the Healthy Homes. And they have things about personal protective equipment for the ones on the disaster recovery. And then again, we have additional information, follow-up information. And a lot of times people ask, well, what kind of follow-up information would a person use? And the answer is, for instance, they might say, oh, okay, I think I have lead paint. The building was built, 1950s, but now I don't know what else to do. So instead of giving them a 100-page guide that has every step on how to look at lead paint, we give them reference guides just on that subject. So they don't have to go through a 200-page guide, look through mold and carbon monoxide if lead is just their problem. So we're really specific. The overarching goal on these was to keep them as small as possible and still retain the critical information so that they could be used for mass distribution, because we know that's the number one request. The number one request is the Rebuild Healthy Homes, and the Healthy Homes guides just are so many pages that we have to make them smaller so they can be easier understood by clients and agencies and to be easier to comprehend. Again, one of the issues we've run into with the number of times that I've done disaster recovery webinars, especially post-disaster, is, again, we don't want to overwhelm people. We don't want people to go through their homes with the Healthy Homes Guide and say, I've got all these problems, I just should move out of the house, or I can't move out of the house. What do I do? And I'm concerned about my children. So we've tried to make them as small as possible so they aren't overwhelming, but give the critical information that they need. So as I end my part of the presentation, and more than happy to answer any questions, there are three websites that you should be familiar with. The extension healthyhomes.org and the healthyhomespartnership.net go to the organization, the agency that I represent, funded by HUD and USDA, which is the Healthy Homes Partnership. So either of those top links will take you to our website where we have additional information. And in many cases, we have a representative in the Healthy Homes Partnership who covers your region. So for instance, Dale Morton in the U.S. Virgin Islands is listed. So you know directly how to get a hold of him instead of going through us to get to him. And then the bottom one, which is a tremendous amount of information, is the HUD.gov/Healthy Homes. So all of these guides, and we even have additional guides. We have guides on things like guides for Native Americans, American Indians, Alaska Natives, specific guides for that community. We have guides on different regions, and all of those are at HUD.gov/Healthy Homes. So this should be, bookmarked on your web browser to go quickly to there, because you'll be amazed at how much information, either in web pages or in guides or both, that you can gain from that link. And then the final thing is This is my contact information. My job at the University of Missouri, besides teaching some classes for architectural students, is also to be an extension outreach educator. So even though I'm housed in Missouri, I oftentimes answer questions all over. I've even been in Europe and in Australia before advising people. But if you have a specific question, you're in Puerto Rico and you said, I went to your webinar and I have, I need some more information about this one topic, or I saw the guide and I have some specific questions, please feel free to email me. I would normally put my phone number. I'm hoping that very soon I'll have a phone number, but the reality is I'm in a state where COVID is still a huge problem, and so I'm actually working at home through my office, and so if you called my phone number, it would take a while for me to get back to you. So the easiest way to get a hold of me right now is email, and it's my last name, first initial, @missouri.edu. So that is the end of my part of the presentation, and I believe that our hosts will actually now talk about questions that I will answer, and then they have some closing information.
Go ahead, Lourdes.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Debbie. Excellent presentation, Mike. Very detailed, and you also provide a lot of samples and related educational material that are ready to be downloaded by the participants. Now is the questions and answer session. I will read the questions and Mike will be providing the answers, of course. First question. Are the publications available in Spanish?
Very good question. So one of the hosts that's on the webinar right now is Magali Mendez from the HUD office in Puerto Rico. She is in the process of translating those guides into Spanish. It takes a little bit of time. I'm not going to tell you how long it's going to take her because I always give her leeway, as does HUD, on how long it takes, but they will be available fairly soon in Spanish, and she might want to address that because she's one of the people on this webinar, but they are in the process of being translated into Spanish. So we hope to have those guides soon.
Thank you. The next question is, does the publications cover issues particular to our area? For example, Sahara dust, mosquitoes, etc.?
Say that one more time.
Yes, sorry. Does the publications cover issues particular to our area? For example, Sahara dust, that every summer we get a lot of Sahara dust. And also during the summer and rain season, we have a lot of mosquitoes. So the publications cover that situation?
Yes. In fact, it's actually highlighted in the guides. You'll see that there, as you're going through the guides, there will be a page where there's a bubble, and it says special concerns for the area, and it will say not only like mosquitoes, but it will say like safer ways of controlling mosquitoes around the property, especially if there's standing water. So yes, there is a suggestion sometimes on DEET or other chemicals as a last resort, but we also talk about steps that a person can take, again, like not having standing water if possible. I know it's hard after a very heavy rain, and other things that people can do that are safer so that they don't have to go directly to something like DEET. Now, having said that, we do recommend in those special concerns on mosquitoes, we do recommend DEET because of Zika, which is still a problem. We don't have enough problems with COVID, and we still have, issues with Zika. So it talks about, where information to go on that and how to eradicate those. So we do, in fact, have those as special concerns in the guides.
Excellent. Thank you. I have a comment here by Magali Mendez. She's indicating that HUD is currently in the final step translating the Puerto Rico publications. The U.S. Virgin Islands publications will be translated too. And now we continue with, yeah?
Just to add to that, I put in a good word for Magali. Magali is one of the most wonderful people I've worked with. She's very knowledgeable. When we do Spanish webinars where we co-present, she knows the material, so she's not just translating. And so for those of you in Puerto Rico, if you have never worked with Magali, please do. She's a fantastic person. So I assure you that the translations will be exactly, perfect for the subject. So don't worry about it. The Spanish version says something different than the English version. So she's a fantastic person.
Yes, she does. And I know her for a very long time, and she is excellent. I echo your comments. So the next question, Mike, is what is considered a healthy home? Please name the basic criteria.
Very good. Okay, so I'm going to go back on the slides real quick because the answer to that question is the 8 principles. So, for instance, we can get into the details. I pulled that slide up. We could go into the details, and I'll give it some examples here real quick. Keep it clean. So the 8 principles are the guiding factors. So the answer is, what is the guiding principles and what is the specifics we're talking about in these healthy homes guides? It's these 8 principles. So for each of these, we talk about, for instance, keep it safe. We'll address things like children getting into poisons, elderly slipping, older Americans and older residents of homes slipping or falling. It may not be specific and say everything it needs to say about that, but it gives a follow-up link to get more information on that. So the answer to the direct question is the 8 principles of healthy homes are what we do. So for example, keep it contaminant-free. We talk about radon and we talk about carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is a huge issue. I don't know how much of an issue it is in the last month or so in Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands, but in Texas and Oklahoma, in Kansas, and even Missouri, when we had that tremendous ice storm and snowstorm, and the power went out in Texas, there were some people who made a very poor decision. They said, I don't want to die from the cold. I've got to heat my home. And then they would use a propane heater or charcoal grill or something that was not properly ventilated. And unfortunately, and this is just tragic, every time I see this in the news, it just breaks my heart, but they died of carbon monoxide poisoning. So their attempt to save themselves actually killed them. And so when we talk about keep it contaminant-free, we talk about carbon monoxide and where it is in the home and how you have to vent it. And the other things like how to get a carbon monoxide detector so you don't have that. So each of these 8 principles will have home toxins related to it. Keep it clean involves many times mold, although mold is also contaminant. Keep it dry. That also concerns mold. So in each of these 8 principles, we will address the home toxin or the issue, like the safety issue that is under that category, how to find it in the home, what to do about it. If you can't do anything yourself, either because of your age or your health or your knowledge base, then here's a follow-up place that you can go to either contact a specialist or an expert or get more information about how you can do it yourself. So for instance, in mold, there's a certain amount of mold where we never recommend that a person do it on their own. And if you have 100 square feet of mold, or like there's an entire room full of mold, it actually can be worse for you to remove the mold yourself, especially without the proper protective equipment. So we talk about who might be able to help you with that mold removal, what to do if you can't hire a person, could you do part of it yourself, things like that. So those are all addressed in those guides. Now again, in order to keep the guide smaller, instead of giving a 200-page guide, we have the most basic critical information, and then if that person wants to have specific information on, like for instance, lead removal, it talks about how to contact someone about lead removal or lead mitigation, which basically is keeping in place, but keeping it so that no one can touch it or breathe it in. We talk about where the agencies are in the United States where you could find your local lead abatement person, how to know if they're licensed. And so we always give information either in the guide or a follow-up link to that information, and we always keep it to what we call one link. So the guides don't say go to this thing in HUD, and then the HUD guide doesn't say go to this thing. Once you click on one link, it goes exactly to all the information you needed to know about that subject.
Thank you. Thank you. The next question is, are hard copies of the guides available?
Very good question. The answer is no. and I want to explain on behalf of, although I'm not a HUD employee, I want to hopefully talk about HUD's opinion on this. Number one is because of COVID, especially, some federal agencies, a lot of their employees are not actually in their office. And in fact, I think some of them haven't been to their office in over a year. I haven't been to my office in over a year. And so the practicality of publishing these and making hard copies is problematic, because in order for the printing services for the federal government to print these out, everybody kind of has to be in their office to authorize and do things like that. Second of all, one of the issues with publications, and this is not just HUD, but almost all federal agencies, is that they'll print up thousands and thousands of these guides, and then maybe 500 of them will be used on a year, and then it takes up warehouse space. So the answer is, at some point in the future, there is a likelihood that some of these guides will be published. But for right now, what we're asking people to do is to go ahead and download it and print it yourself. They are formatted for either booklet or for individual pages and front and back if you prefer. But at this point, it's hard to commit to hard copies just because there's some unknowns with how the government's going to get back after COVID, and you know, even in the printing offices, some people are not in there anymore because they're home for COVID. So it's hard to give you a specific date, but that's something, you know, one of the people from the HUD Office of Lead Hazard Control and Healthy Homes, besides Magali, is the communications person at the Office of Lead Hazard Control, and he's the one that usually gets involved in printing of the documents. And so he's heard that question, and then we can have a discussion after the webinar about the likelihood of printing hard copies. But for right now, it just can't be done in any specific way because of COVID.
Thank you. And that is our new normal, right?
Yeah, I'm hoping that we get back to where we can print some hard copies. But for right now, again, even though they are, you know, copyrighted and have a date on it, the permission is as long as you don't change the information, and they are PDFs, so you could change some information, but as long as you don't change the information, then you can print your own copies. I also want to point out one more thing while I'm thinking about it. One of the things about these guides, the disaster recovery guide, the 36-page one, and the Healthy Homes guides, there's actually space on the back page. And it's not just because we like a lot of extra space, but the purpose of that space on the back cover is so that your agency can actually place your own specific information as a sticker on that guide. So for instance, if you're a Red Cross in Puerto Rico and you want to print out these guides for the people that you serve, but you also want to have a sticker, I mean, there is an email and phone number for the Red Cross that we put in the guide. But if you're an agency that wasn't listed in there, but you want to have a sticker that says, how do you go ahead and go to this place, we've left space for that. So we're very sensitive to all the agencies on this webinar wanting to access that information, but also to promote their agency that is giving the guide to that client.
Thank you. Last but not least, 5G internet antenna, is that harmful to those who live in that house?
So the answer is, and I wish I could give you a direct answer, that is outside of my expertise. I am familiar with what the issue is with you know, different frequencies of waves and how 5G works, but I am in no way an expert in that subject, and I would not be serving you very well if I answered that question. So that's probably a better one for one of the other federal agencies, like I'm trying to think of which one, maybe CDC, maybe you know, I'm trying to think of some other federal agencies, but I say for right now that's outside of my expertise.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We really hope you enjoyed the presentation and take some time to answer the 3 questions pulled shown on the screen right now. And we also would like to mention that for tomorrow, we will have this presentation in English, in Spanish, and also this week we will have another one on the 25th, exploring the guides to expanding mitigation, whole community and equity. And also a special thank you to Mike and Magali for presenting this important topic this afternoon, and looking forward for our next presentation. Please provide your answers to the poll. That is the way we would like to modify or be in compliance with your needs for this type of webinar. Thank you very much. You are free to drop.
Thank you, everybody.